There are two pieces of defense in their second contention. The first says that you have to couple economic reform with any trade infrastructure to see any manifestation of growth. They say that free trade agreements literally do this, but what we would say is that a free trade agreement is just a free trade agreement. It is not an actual policy from a politician to reform an economy. We say that even if you have an increased amount of trade, insofar as you still have an agrarian economy, you still have a lot of people in poverty, and you don't actually get the benefits from all of this new trade. But then we would say that, or he concedes the response, that there are varying regulations throughout the EU, which means that even if China joins, the regulations still mean that free trade does not exist and the tariffs still exist. This is defense of the free trade agreement. But the last response is that in the status quo, there is nothing stopping China and the EU from making trade agreements. We say that right now, France and China have already created a free trade agreement that is a non-unique, meaning that it can happen in either world with or without the BRI. But then, let's go to our case on the top at the funding. We tell you that right now, the Belt and Road Initiative is collapsing and that the EU is going to save it. They extend one response on Chinese collapse that says that investment is up 14% and that they'll fund it in the long term. But what we would say is that insofar as domestic spending is down literally 0% in private banks and 89% in state banks, they literally cannot fund it right now. And we would also say that because they're in such a period of economic downturn, they're not going to come out of it anytime soon to the point that they can actually finish projects like CPEC. But then he says that it's in geopolitical interest, but we would say that if he physically does not have the capital to fund it, he cannot do this. But then he extends a couple of responses as to why the EU won't fund. The first is that the EU has economic downturn. A couple of things. First, we would say that it creates returns because the EU can pick and choose which investments, meaning that they're going to make smart investments, which is good for an economy in a recession. But second, we would say that they use an external action budget, which is not specific to, even if they're facing economic downturn, the external budget can just be used. It's not going to hurt their economy. Third, we would say that they wouldn't just join the Belt and Road Initiative and then let it die immediately. They have an incentive to keep it alive, which is why they actually fund it. But then, at the end, they say that private investment is going to be able to keep it alive. But we say, one, that private investment is not enough to keep it alive insofar as CPEC and the BRI are huge economic investments. It is not going to be enough to keep it alive. But also we would say that CPEC is not super profitable. So if it was just private investors investing, they probably wouldn't be investing in CPEC. They would be investing in more profitable ventures elsewhere. But then, let's go to our argument about the Indo-Pac War, where we tell you on our second warrant about India that that CPEC encircles India and poses an existential threat. Where they read two responses, or at the top, they say that CPEC is never going to collapse because Pakistan and China are increasing investments. A couple of things. First, we would say that insofar as we win the funding debate, we win that China can never increase investment because they're facing sharp economic downturn and do not have the money to. But then on the argument about Pakistan, we would say that Pakistan is such a small economy, they can never finance CPEC to its completion, which is when we get our impacts. We say that as soon as CPEC is finished, India feels the existential threat because the power balance in the region has shifted to favor India, shifted to favor Pakistan, which means that India lashes out. We say that lash out is really bad because it most likely leads to nuclear war. They read two responses at the bottom that India has lashed out and there wasn't a war before, but that was before existential threats exist. Now that it's existential, that's when the big lash out happens, and that is also when they turn to nuclear weapons. We would say that this outweighs their case for a few reasons. First is on scope and magnitude because it is literally everyone in the entire world dying, but second is on reversibility because if you go into poverty, you can always come out. They read this argument about how resource wars are really bad, but we would say that resource wars aren't caused by poverty, they're caused by a lack of natural resources. Poverty doesn't create that.